All right, let's talk about something you've probably heard a million times. Trickle-down economics. You know, it's that term that gets thrown around constantly in political debates, and usually it's not a compliment, right? But what if I told you we're going to dig into a really provocative idea from the economist Thomas Sowell? He basically asks, what if this incredibly famous theory was never a theory at all?
So this right here is the classic horse and sparrow metaphor. You hear this a lot when people want to criticize the whole idea of trickle-down. And I mean, the picture it paints is, well, it's pretty brutal. The idea is you feed the horse, that's the rich, a ton of oats, and you just hope that some of it, passes through for the sparrows on the road to pick up. It's a really vivid and, frankly, a very effective way to slam the concept. And that brings us right back to the central, kind of mind-bending question of this whole explainer. What if one of the most famous economic theories just never existed? I mean, really think about that. This is the core of Thomas Sowell's argument. He's basically saying we've all been arguing about a ghost, a caricature that was cooked up purely for political reasons, not something any serious economist ever actually put forward.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. Sowell basically went on a hunt. He started digging through the history books, looking for the source, trying to find the economist who actually came up with and argued for trickle-down theory. And after all that searching, he found, well, absolutely nothing.
Now, seriously, he argues that this term, trickle-down theory, you just can't find it in the serious histories of economic ideas, not even in this monster of a book, Schumpeter's History of Economic Analysis, which is over 1,200 pages long. You'd think a theory this famous would get a mention, right? But nope. Its absence is really, really strange.
And get this, Sowell actually threw down a public challenge. He said, okay, name any economist from any school of thought who actually advocated for a trickle-down theory. And the answer he got back was crickets, just silence. So his point is, this isn't a real theory. It's a label, a straw man, created by critics to attack an argument that nobody was actually making.
And this is where Sowell says the real confusion happens. It's a deliberate mix-up between two totally different things. You've got the caricature, this whole trickle-down story, and then you have the actual economic policy, which is usually about tax cuts. He argues that critics have been incredibly successful at blurring the lines, making everyone think that the policy is based on that ridiculous caricature.
So that leads to the million-dollar question, doesn't it? If proponents of these tax cuts weren't actually arguing for wealth to just trickle down, then what was their argument? What was the actual logic they were using? Let's dig into what they were really saying. All right, Section 2, the real argument, changing investor behavior. So according to Sowell, the actual argument, and this goes way back to Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon in the 1920s, had nothing to do with distributing money. It was all about incentives. The whole idea was about how to change investors' behavior to get more money flowing into the economy. Okay, so here's the logic, broken down into 4 steps. Step 1, you've got crazy high tax rates on the top earners. Step 2, because of those high rates, investors aren't putting their money into new businesses. Instead, they're hiding it in tax-exempt shelters. Now, here's the key part. Step 3, you lower those tax rates. Suddenly, investing in the actual economy looks way more attractive than hiding the money. And step 4, that capital comes out of hiding, flows back into businesses, which creates jobs and growth. And here's the kicker, it can actually lead to more tax revenue for the government, not less.
And this is exactly what Mellon was talking about here. He's basically saying that capital, money, is going to go wherever it's treated best. If you tax it too much in one place, it's not just going to sit there and take it. It's going to find a safer place to go, like these tax-exempt bonds. The whole point of the tax cuts was to coax that money back out into the open where it could actually do something productive.
Okay, Section 3, a pattern across decades, the data, and bipartisan history. So that's the argument, right? But the big question is, did it actually work? And was this just some one-party idea? Let's take a look at the data, starting with that first big test run back in the 1920s.
So in 1921, the top income tax rate was 73%. Just let that sink in for a second. 73%. This is exactly the kind of number that Mellon was pointing to when he said investors were running for the hills, looking for those tax shelters.
But by 1929, after all the Mellon tax cuts, that rate had been slashed all the way down to 24%. I mean, that is a huge, huge drop. So, what do you think happened to the taxes paid by the rich?
Well, here's the part that sounds completely backwards, but it's what the proponents of this policy always point to.
In 1921, when the tax rate was 73%, the richest Americans paid about 30% of all income taxes. But in 1929, after the rate was cut to 24%, their share of the tax pie more than doubled to 65%. The argument is simple. The lower rates brought a whole lot more money out of the shadows and onto the tax rolls.
Now, I know what you might be thinking. This sounds like a purely Republican talking point, right? But what's fascinating, and what Sowell really highlights, is that this wasn't a partisan thing for a very long time. This idea actually has a long and pretty surprising bipartisan history. So here's the Republican president, Calvin Coolidge, back in 1924. And listen to what he's saying. He's not talking about some grand theory of helping the rich. His goal is practical, to secure revenue. He's basically saying that just jacking up the rate doesn't automatically mean the government gets more money. Okay, now fast forward almost 40 years, and just listen to this quote from a Democrat, President John F. Kennedy, in 1962. He says it's a paradoxical truth that to get more tax revenue, you sometimes have to cut tax rates. It's almost the exact same argument as Coolidge's, just from the other side of the aisle. The focus is still on revenue and growth, not on trickle-down.
All right, our final section here. Two competing visions, how we see the economy. So, where does this all leave us? According to Sowell, this whole debate really boils down to two completely different ways of looking at the economy. It's not really about one tax policy versus another, it's about your fundamental worldview.
So you've got these two competing visions. The first is what you might call a zero-sum vision. It sees the economy as a fixed pie. There's only so much to go around, so the big question is about distribution, who gets what slice. In this view, if someone gets a bigger slice, someone else has to get a smaller one. The trickle-down caricature fits perfectly into this worldview. But then there's the other vision, the positive-sum one. Here, the focus isn't on slicing the pie, it's on growing the pie. The goal is to create more wealth for everyone, based on the idea that the right incentives can make the whole economy bigger.
And that really leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? It's not just about economics, but about how we talk to each other about, well, everything. If Sowell's analysis is right, it means one of the biggest economic debates of the last century was basically an argument about something that never even existed. So it really makes you wonder, how often are we arguing about what people are actually saying versus arguing against the cartoon version we have of them in our head?